Let's start with today's massive attack by the Russian occupiers across the entire territory of Ukraine. As President Zelensky said, understanding that the Russian occupiers are suffering colossal losses, every patch, every centimeter of Ukrainian land comes at the cost of an enormous number of Russian soldiers' lives. And now we are witnessing yet another missile attack, which is essentially pointless as most of the aerial targets were shot down. What is the goal? What is the so-called Second Army of the world trying to achieve, considering they promised to capture the entire Donetsk region, but in reality they continue to strike deep into the rear, which has nothing to do with military logistics or anything of the sort?
Well, essentially, from a military standpoint, the enemy is primarily trying to disrupt our logistics, our rear logistics, and is attempting to strike at energy infrastructure facilities. As for, in my opinion, the main element of this tactic has changed somewhat recently. We see that the Russians are betting, so to speak, on localized strikes, which on the one hand seem pointless at first glance, although strikes on critical infrastructure still have consequences for us. And most importantly, these localized strikes are now targeting specific locations but are relatively small in scale. Unfortunately, we are losing people, and unfortunately, we have wounded as well. But these strikes are ongoing. Let's at least look at today's attack. That is, Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, was chosen, and accordingly it was a combined attack because, let's say, the Russians clearly do not have enough resources and capabilities today to carry out such combined strikes across the entire territory of Ukraine. They chose Kyiv. Before this, we see that almost every day, actually not almost, but literally every day, Odessa region and the city of Odessa are being terrorized. 1 or 2 Shaheds, but they are launched and flying every hour. This is also an attempt to exhaust the civilian population because people are constantly living in anxiety day and night. And it's clear that this determines the rhythm of life, and obviously it also determines the way the economy operates. And of course, this is an attempt to exhaust the air defense system because behind these weapons are people who inevitably get worn out as well. It is precisely these key factors, I think, that have shaped this particular Russian tactic today. In a word, this is terror, psychological, even psychological, emotional terror. Therefore, it is obvious that the Russians will continue using this tactic. It is quite likely they are also testing other, let's say, variations within this tactic. But it is already clear, I think, that after such an attempt to exhaust over several days, a massive strike is then delivered. And in fact, we've seen this as well, for example, in the south of our country, if we take the Odessa region as an example of what is happening today.
Let's move on to the situation at the front. There is also a lot of disinformation from the Russians about this now, since the Russian Federation can no longer hide its failures in any way. The Pokrovsk direction remains the hottest spot. And of course, the largest amount of Russian propaganda is also concentrated around it. That's why it's so important to tell our viewers and the whole world every day what is actually happening there right now. Please, could you provide your analysis on this direction?
Roughly the same thing will be said today in the reports of the so-called Ministry of Defense of the so-called Russian Federation that yet another set of targets has been destroyed in the capital. If you count and look at the information releases from the Russian Federation, these targets have already been destroyed at least 10 times. So we see that this applies both to such terrorist strikes and purely to actions on the front line. In fact, there's that well-known convoy that's already been dubbed the Mad Max convoy. By analogy with the famous film, Russian propagandists replayed it countless times, but in the end they forgot to show the most important part, the finale. How did the fighting end for these monsters? In fact, it was a rout, and I hope this video has made its way around the world today. That's why there are indeed a lot of rumors, a lot of information campaigns which concern not only Pokrovsk in particular, but also other hottest spots on the front, especially regarding Pokrovsk, because today Pokrovsk is, let's say, a kind of litmus test for everything happening on the front, and especially on the Donetsk front, because today the Russians have once again claimed that they have practically occupied Pokrovsk, and that in just a month or a month and a half they will be ready to occupy the Donetsk region. None of this corresponds to reality. This is also obvious to everyone. This is above all an attempt. They want to demonstrate the might, the supposed might of the Russian Federation, to show our partners and allies that it is necessary to sit down at the negotiating table, but not with Ukraine, with the Russians, because they control the situation, they are ready to keep fighting, and they have the resources to do so. In fact, this is what we are witnessing today. The fighting is heavy, the fighting is brutal. However, Russian propaganda, precisely against this emotional backdrop, because each of us internalizes the events at the front, we see what is happening. And in fact, it is these emotional moments that the Russians, through propaganda, try to exploit, trying to shake our mood, our emotions. And unfortunately, though it's understandable, sometimes they succeed. On the other hand, we are saying that as of today, that is why we see the situation in Pokrovsk being commented on at the very highest level. This shows that despite all the difficulties, the situation in Pokrovsk is exactly as it really is. In other words, these are the realities we are facing today. Yes, the enemy has entered the city. Yes, the enemy is trying to attack the central and northern parts of the city. However, we are saying that first and foremost, the most important thing is the defensive operation, the defensive action of our units in Pokrovsk. It is ongoing. Today, all sorts of scenarios are being drawn about how this battle might end. We are not going to talk about them today, not because we don't know or don't want to. We fully understand that the commanders on the ground, as well as those higher up, are working through various scenarios, even the most negative developments of the situation. In my opinion today, contrary to what the enemy expected, the situation has remained within, very conditionally of course, but within a kind of neutrality. That is, there have been no drastic changes on the front specifically at this location. All this is thanks to the courage of our soldiers, the bravery of the Defense Force units, and in fact, Russian propaganda won't tell you that those very columns we mentioned are being destroyed, that enemy assault groups in the north of Pokrovsk are being eliminated. And in fact, the logistics, which the enemy wanted to completely destroy, are still clearly functioning today. It's working. Is that bad? It's good. Obviously, it's under very difficult conditions. But the logistics of the Ukrainian defense forces are still helping, and today make it possible to carry out this very defensive operation.
This kind of propaganda is constantly celebrating, saying they've struck targets, like the ones you're talking about. Yes, they've destroyed the same object 10 times already. As the Russian Ministry of Defense writes, all targets have been hit, yet they keep striking, thus confirming that nothing has actually been hit. So this so-called air defense shield of Ukraine, in particular Kyiv, the Kyiv region and other cities, is reliable. And here's an interesting point. What, in this situation, could be the red line for the Russian occupiers when it comes to stopping their air attacks, considering that the creation of the so-called drone wall has now been announced, which overall will be able to prevent any aerial targets of the Russian occupiers from crossing into certain territories? In your opinion, as a military person, where is that red line for the occupiers? At what point will they simply see no reason to continue attacking certain cities?
Well, I think tonight was a particularly vivid example, though with a Black Sea flavor. We're talking about our attack on the port of Novorossiysk, the largest one. The oil terminal, the largest oil depot on the Black Sea, from where the shadow Russian fleet sets out to sea, goes out into wider waters, operates and earns the money that Russia uses to wage war against Ukraine, replenishing its budget. And as many times as we've said on your broadcasts, this is very easy to verify that this is a juicy target and sooner or later it would get hit. And it did get hit. I think that now the defense forces, having tested this route, will no longer stop. A very significant event, in my opinion, because it's quite likely that these could be Neptunes, or it could even be Flamingo, a very bad missile, according to Russian propagandists. Today, it's actually quite interesting to read those comments. It's quite possible that no one will comment anymore because some people are no longer alive, I hope, and others will decide it's better not to comment at all, since there's nothing left to comment on. And of course, there should be more strikes like this. And look at how systematically the defense forces are acting today. This is also about red lines, about Ukraine's own military red lines. The defense forces are systematically operating on temporarily occupied territory. Last night, there were strikes in Donetsk. This is not just by chance. These are not strikes on residential buildings like the Russians do. These are strikes on command posts, on warehouses with weapons and ammunition. In fact, well, last night made that clear. Plus, there's the Russian energy system. Again, on your broadcast, we talked about how the Russians have problems with their regional localized energy infrastructure system. Somewhere a button is pressed and then, as they say, this switch triggers for several regions of the Russian Federation. In fact, today in Volgograd, the authorities were already forced to admit, yes, something hit, yes, there are problems with power supply there. Moreover, this is a substation that is actually operational, and it also serves other regions of the Russian Federation neighboring Volgograd. This is the main red line. Our strength, our capabilities, which I hope will be scaled up primarily in missile projects, are what can actually force Russia, at the very least, to sit down at the negotiating table, or at least to cease fire. That is why Russia is in a hurry on the battlefield today. It's obvious, trying to use the maximum amount of resources. Well, let's put it this way. In a certain sense, the person sitting in the Kremlin has decided to go all in, fully committing to this course of action.